Hey everybody, Questwise here, and in this video we're going to start our series where we talk about theories of magic systems in tabletop role-playing games. I've been doing some research, I've been doing some reading, I've been doing some writing, and I had come to the conclusion that I would start with where it all began, and we would start talking about Vancian magic in this video in particular. In following videos, we'll go on to talk about things like freeform magic, which is you'll see when we get to that video how I feel about freeform magic. Interesting take on that. Point buy system magic, theories behind the different magic systems and whatnot. But I guess we should really start at the beginning of what is magic and define what magic is as a whole before we can actually explore that within the context of a role-playing game. So in doing some research and doing some reading, I came up with a few quotes that I found were pretty interesting about what magic is. And we're talking about magic not just inside role-playing games, but the sort of historical and cultural ideas of what magic is and was. So one of the quotes I found was, "The power of apparently influencing the course of events by using mysterious or supernatural forces. It's the power to move mountains and raise cities, as well as the subtle manipulation of unseen forces." So starting with Vancian magic today, and we'll get into what that is in just a minute. It by no means the origins of magic itself. When we look at it in a sort of cultural aspect, the idea of magic goes back to the very dawning of man. The ideas of charms and relics and places of power and influence throughout the world having special significance to certain things. The idea of omens and days, certain days and happenings and circumstances in which people drew interest in, and they believed that there was some sort of influence or some sort of supernatural force at work. At some point, we as humans thought that we could sort of channel those abilities, those influences, those powers, and began to do things like creating charms and tokens and totems, which we believed had sort of influence over people and events and places and things. Whether or not that's true, whether or not you believe in those things, is not the focus of this video. But what you have to sort of understand the sort of cultural context behind magic, and as well as magic within fiction. We see magic differently from Tolkien's perspective than we do in Robert E. Howard's perspective. We see it differently in some of Edgar Rice Burroughs' writings, as well as what we'll look at today in Jack Vance's Vancian Magic as well too, Tales of the Dying Earth. So let's start there. What is Vancian magic? If you've played Dungeons and Dragons for any length of time, you'll know that the most popular connotation, the most popular sort of nomenclature for the magic system is Vancian magic. Now, we'll get into how that's changed over time throughout the different editions, but Vancian magic is based upon the ideas, that Jack Vance had written up in his Tales of the Dying Earth series of stories and short novelettes. The idea that magic spells must be memorized before they can be cast, and once they are cast, they are erased from your memory until you take the time to rememorize those things. There's a few sections in this early stories that I want to read to you that I think were very highly regarded by Gary Gygax when he was designing Dungeons and Dragons. And you'll instantly see when I read these to you, the influence that they had upon the magic system that he used in the original 1974 of Men in Magic D&D supplement, as well as Advanced Dungeons and Dragons first edition, and it was sort of the same all the way up until about second edition, where it began to vary at that point. But the first section I want to read to you is page 5. So very early on in these stories, we began to see the influence of this type of magic, the way that Jack Vance had created this idea of magic being very something you have to spend time with, and that you have to impress into your brain, that the words themselves were maybe alive, that the conjunction of syllables and words together created a specific result when cast, when prepared, when recited, along with other sort of ideas put into place, things like somatic components, verbal components, material components, all of which Gary Gygax placed into the original Dungeons & Dragons. But this first quote, this first selection from the book says, then he sat down, and from a journal he chose the spells he would like to take with him. What dangers he might meet he could not know, so he selected 3 spells of general application: the excellent Prismatic Spray, Fandel's Mantle of Stealth, and the spell of the Slow Hour. And as that story goes on, this is from the story Turan of Mir. You'll see this play out, and you'll see how, and if you get it, please pick up a copy of this. If you don't already own a copy of this is pretty readily available, I believe. It was published by Orb Books. You get these at any good bookstore. This is a great collection. This is a collection of all of the Dying Earth tales, and is somewhere in my favorite realm of fiction, that sort of balance between science fiction and fantasy, or science fantasy, some people call it. But you get the impression there that the spells, he's sitting down to collect the spells he thinks he might need, because he has no idea what he's going to face. So the idea that it's not just a on the fly, I can just cast any spell I want to at any time, is very evident in this idea that he has to prepare. He has to figure out what spells he wants to take with him, because, and he expresses into this that he can only press into his memory so much magical power, and that the more that you exercise, like a muscle, the more that you exercise this, your brain, your body, being in tune with these magical forces, can you begin to press more in. But your body can only take so much. It can only hold so much magical energy, so much sort of arcane knowledge before it sort of collapses, or, it explodes. It doesn't really go into detail about what happens when those things go awry. The next section I want to read to you is from page 19. It's I believe the second story in this Marzurian the Magician, and it says, later, when black night lie across the forest, he would seek through his books for spells to guard him through the unpredictable glades. They would be poignant, corrosive spells, of such a nature that one would daunt the brain of an ordinary man, and 2 render him mad. By dint of stringent exercise, he could encompass 4 of the most formidable, or 6 of the lesser spells. So this idea that his exercising himself, sort of continuing to press magic into his body to sort of expand his mind, to allow himself to understand these magical influences, he was able to take a few of the more powerful spells, or more of the lesser known spells. Here's the next section I want to read to you. Here's where it gets really interesting, and I kind of understand why Gary Gygax had sort of encapsulated the spells the way they were. Not only are we looking at memorization of spells before they can be cast, and that they must be recorded in some sort of book, a wizard's tome, a journal of some kind, but also the idea that wizards can only know so many spells. By gamifying that, it came into the idea that there's only so many spells you knew per level, and beyond the first one, especially early on, the you had to go seek out spells. You had to either learn them from another wizard, you had to steal them from another wizard, or you had to discover these lost spells. And you'll see what I'm talking about in this next section, which is on page 22. Midnight found him in his study, poring through leather-bound tomes and untidy portfolios. At one time, 1,000 or more runes, spells, incantations, curses, and other sorceries had been known. The reach of Grand Mothalam, I'm going to slaughter all of these names, Ascilius, the Ide of Cartouche, Alamery of the south, the land of the falling wall, and to the east, swarmed with sorcerers of every description, of whom the chief of these was Arch-Necromancer Fandel. 100 spells Fandel personally had formulated, though rumor said that demons whispered at his ear when he wrought these magics. Poncilia the Pious, when ruler of Grand Mothalam, put Fandel to torment, and after a terrible night he killed Fandel and outlawed sorcery throughout the land. The wizards of the Grand Mothalam fled like beetles under a strong light. The lore was dispersed with them and forgotten, until now. At this dim time, when the sun darkens, wilderness obscures Ascilius, and the white city Cain half in ruins, only a few more than 100 spells remained to the knowledge of man. Of these, Mazarian had access to 73, and gradually, by stratagem and negotiation, he was securing the others. So this idea that magic was rare, that magic was something that had to be studied, that had to be sought out, that had to be discovered, was very, I think, important to Gary when he was creating this game. He wanted to impress the idea that magic users had knowledge that no one else had, and that they, in a sense, on paper, looked like they were extremely powerful. And if you play through Dungeons & Dragons, especially the earlier editions of Dungeons & Dragons, they do become very powerful. Once you've reached certain levels of magic user, you begin to have access to things that far outweigh any other character in the game. But early on, you were the weakest character. Playing a magic user meant you had very, very low hit points. You had access to basically no weapons whatsoever other than a staff or a dagger. You couldn't wear armor. At first level, you knew, what was it? I think you could cast one spell. You maybe only knew like 3 of them. So you were very, very weak. But the idea, I think, behind all this was that while you were still a fledgling sort of magician, magic user, wizard, you still had access to knowledge that normal men did not, and that made you dangerous. And I think that gets lost a lot in gaming the game, when playing the game itself. In my personal opinion, I think that the early days, because D&D was based on Chainmail, which was a fantasy version of a tabletop war game, I feel like the people that were sort of coming into the role-playing hobby at the time were still playing the war game. There was times that they had to figure out traps and clues and puzzles. A lot of it was based upon combat. The rules for combat take up most of the game itself. And I think that the direction of the idea of magic being very powerful and being very secretive and being very arcane, archaic, kind of got lost in the shuffle a little bit. And, it got this connotation that wizards were weak and they were going to die, and you might as well just get used to it. Now, most of the characters of early editions of D&D did die, and it was actually encouraged that the players had several characters at their disposal so that they had a backup when things went awry. But we can see that the idea of Vancian magic survives through, OD&D or original D&D, through the basic systems as well, into things like AD&D First Edition, Second Edition, and Third Edition was where things began to become different, began to deviate away from the traditional ideas of Vancian magic. In Third Edition, the idea was that you didn't have to memorize spells, you simply had to prepare them. Now, thematically, it's the same process. You still had to take time every morning to look at your spell book, and spell books have always been very important in that aspect. But the idea behind them had shifted a bit in that you were preparing your spells, not memorizing them, simply looking them over and figuring out. You always had this bank of spells available, but preparing the ones that you might need. This also gave you a stable of spells that were always readily available, that were sometimes somehow free to cast, as it were. Fourth edition threw the Vancian system completely out the window. Say what you will about fourth edition. I know that there's a huge amount of sort of dislike for fourth edition Dungeons and Dragons. I enjoyed it for what it was at the time. I call it the plug and play edition. It's my theory that when fourth edition came out, it was Wizards of the Coast trying to bring people from playing things like World of Warcraft on the computer back to the tabletop. And to do that, they tried to emulate those ideas of those games, the massive multi-online player games on the tabletop type scale. Thus, you began to have things like spells that were at-will spells, later be known as cantrips in fifth edition. You had daily spells. You had spells that could only be done per encounter, so many times per encounter. So the idea of the Vancian system was completely removed. Now, when fifth edition came around, they sort of went back to that idea. They went back to more of the third edition idea. To me, fifth edition feels like a mixture of second and third edition AD&D, or Dungeons and Dragons, and AD&D second edition and third edition, which went back to being just called Dungeons and Dragons. But that, I mean, and then I think that's a feeling that a lot of people have. Some people don't like fifth edition at all and want to stick with the older editions. For me, the magic system in fifth edition has outgrown its roots. And I feel, and this might be very controversial, and there are some ideas in the Dungeon Master's Guide on how to address this, but I feel as if the Vancian system for the game, the story that fifth edition is trying to tell, just does not fit anymore. I feel as if they should have redesigned the magic system to incorporate the more of that high, epic fantasy, magic is everywhere sort of feeling, especially with things like Eberron and maybe Forgotten Realms a little bit, but definitely Eberron, where magic is a sort of common item. The idea of having to prepare your spells every day and having access to things by gaining just magic randomly everywhere really doesn't fit this sort of Vancian system. And I understand why they're keeping it around. It's a traditional thing. It's been there since the beginning with the, whatever, of fourth edition. But it's been there since the beginning. And to try to maybe keep fans happy, or to just as a traditional sort of way, they've kept the semi-Vancian system in place. In the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition, they do talk about the idea of using spell points to use to cast spells. And I think that's a much better way. Maybe using mana or spell points or whatever you want to call it would fit the idea of 5th edition very, very well. So, the Vancian system of magic, is it worth using? Is it worth pursuing further in games? Well, it's so powerful, it's so iconic that it's even bled its way into the OSR movement, right? things like Labyrinth Lord, things like Lamentations of the Flame Princess, they all use this system. They still stick with this system. For me personally, I think that having read Jack Vance's work, The Tales of the Dying Earth, really reinvigorated me into the Vancian system of magic. I really appreciate his approach to the magic. Now, reading the Vancian tales, the Jack Vance's Dying Earth tales, you get this concept that magic is extremely powerful, that it is extremely different, that it definitely separates those who can cast it from those who cannot. Those who take the time to study, to devote their lives to the seeking out of magic and spells, they are vastly superior to those who have not. And the idea, there's one part in particular, and I'll never be able to find it on the fly right now, but there's one section in particular where there is a magician, a wizard, a magic user, what you will, who has access to all these spells. He has this vast array of power, and yet he even says something about, I don't have the ability to fully restore you. Only a god has that ability, and I don't have, as a mortal, the fortitude, the constitution to channel those types of powers. So there's a limits to it as well too. But I think for me personally, I really appreciate the Jack Vance series of how magic works. I like the idea that magic is dangerous. I like the idea that it is more powerful than we are, that we have to seek it out. I love the idea that, and so Dying Earth, what the idea behind this is that it's far into the future where the Earth is in its sort of death throes. It's this giant bloated red ball in the sky, and the Earth is dying, and slowly, and at some point it will just end. But life goes on, and it's post high technology, although some of that is still there. They talk about cloning and vats, and magic is all woven into that idea. One of the characters in here even says that he is a master spellcaster, and he has spent countless hours devoted to the dark secrets of demons and angels, and that he's also a mathematician. So the idea that magic and science are all sort of blended together, I really enjoy that. And I really enjoy the fact that magic is hard. Magic is not, it must be sought out, and that it is rare. I appreciate that. And I think along the way, with just the growth, and this isn't really a bad thing, with growth of the game of Dungeons and Dragons, this idea has become lost. And it's not so much that it's lost, that it's sort of outgrown this idea, which is why I appreciate things like the OSR. I appreciate the community that's backed itself behind the sort of preservation of the old ways, of the old school gaming techniques and style. And although I think that, and this is, again, purely me, I think that Gary Gygax was a genius when he came up with this concept, this game, and expanding it and doing what he was doing with it. But I think that there might be a better way to incorporating the Vancian idea of magic into a role-playing game. What that is, I haven't really fully realized yet. It's something I'm constantly working on and adding to games that I run, and sort of testing out things with my friends and my fellow players, and saying, hey, we're going to do this one shot, but it's going to be very specific. I want to try something out and see if it works. You might be a magic user, but you might be I'm just trying to fit the ideas into certain things. So it's sort of a scripted, if you will, sort of adventure in which I'm trying out new ideas. But I really appreciate the Dying Earth system of magic that Jack Vance had incorporated into his world. And while it might not be able to be fully realized in a role-playing game, narratively it works out very well. Crunching numbers-wise, I'm not entirely sure yet. But I think that Gary Gygax had encapsulated that very, very well. Now, Jack Vance is not his only influence. If you look at the Appendix N list, which is in the end of the Dungeon Master's Guide for First Edition AD&D, you'll see a vast array of other books that he drew influence from and incorporated those ideas of things. Jack Vance, you're not seeing a lot of fireballs and stuff being cast around. It's interesting things like prismatic spray and slowing time and those kinds of things. There are not vast amounts of sort of damage dealing magic, but things that influence the narrative of the story and stuff as well. So, our look at Vancian Magic. This is the first of a series. Like I said, we're going to go on, and throughout the weeks and coming months, we're going to be talking about other games like what magic is like in Sword and Sorcery Tales, things like Beyond the Black Sea, Conan, Adventures of Conan from Modiphius. We're going to look at freeform magic like Ars Magica. We're going to look at magic from the Palladium fantasy standpoint. We're going to look at magic from the Call of Cthulhu standpoint and see how different companies, different writers, different designers have incorporated these magic systems in their ideals into a game that you can play with your friends that have a set of rules binding them together. Until next time, I'm Questwise. Stay safe and game on, my friends.